You are looking at a small, brown beetle crawling across a flat gray stone. For a full 3 minutes, you have done nothing but watch its legs move, one after the other, in a rhythm that seems almost hypnotic. In our modern world, this is a moment of profound failure, a lapse in productivity that feels like a glitch in the system. But what if this exact moment, this quiet, empty stretch of time, is actually the most important thing that ever happened to our species? Why do we feel that itching, restless heat in our chests when the world goes quiet? Why does your brain treat a lack of stimulation as if it were a physical threat? If we go back 50,000 years, to a world without screens, books, or clocks, what did a person actually do with the 12 hours of daylight that weren't spent running for their life? Was boredom a luxury they couldn't afford, or was it the very thing that forced them to become human? The most common assumption we make about the deep past is that it was a non-stop struggle for survival. We imagine our ancestors as exhausted, frantic shadows, perpetually one step away from starvation or the jaws of a predator. But if that was the case, how did we ever find the time to invent anything at all? Why would a brain that is supposedly focused entirely on the next meal develop the capacity to feel bored? If you ask a modern neuroscientist like Dr. John Eastwood, the author of The Boredom Experience, he will tell you that boredom isn't a modern defect. It is a biological drive, as old and as vital as hunger. When you are hungry, your brain tells you to eat. When you are bored, your brain is telling you that you are understimulated and that your current environment is a dead end. It is an evolutionary alarm bell screaming at you to go find something, anything, new. But if that alarm was ringing in a cave in the middle of the Pleistocene, how did they shut it off? Could it be that we have completely misunderstood how much work it actually takes to survive? For decades, anthropologists operated under the man-the-hunter model, assuming prehistoric life was a brutal, 100-hour work week of constant labor. Then, in 1966, a landmark symposium titled Man the Hunter Changed Everything. A researcher named Marshall Solins presented data that shocked the academic world. He looked at modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Dobju/Hoansi of the Kalahari and found that they only spent about 15 to 20 hours a week on what we would call work. That is less than 3 hours a day spent gathering food and maintaining tools. The rest of the time was spent in a state of absolute, undisputed leisure. Solins famously dubbed these people the original affluent society. They didn't have much, but they had an abundance of the one thing we crave most: time. But if you have 18 hours of free time every single day and no internet, how do you keep from losing your mind? Does the silence of the ancient world mean they were more content, or were they just better at filling the void with each other? The primary solution to prehistoric boredom was likely something so mundane we barely recognize it as an activity today. They talked. But they didn't just talk about the weather or where the berries were growing. Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychologist at Oxford University, proposed a theory that changed how we view the origin of language itself. He argued that language evolved as a form of vocal grooming. In primate societies, bonding is done through physical touch, picking lice and dirt off one another for hours. It's relaxing, it releases endorphins, and it creates trust. But physical grooming is slow. You can only groom one person at a time. As human groups got larger, we needed a way to groom multiple people at once. We started using our voices. We started to gossip. If 65% of all human conversation is still just social gossip, does that mean our greatest intellectual tool was forged by the simple need to kill time? Dunbar's research suggests that gossip wasn't just a side effect of language, it was the purpose. We sat around the fire and talked about who was trustworthy, who was lazy, and who was the best hunter. We built complex social maps of our tribes just to keep our brains occupied during those long, empty afternoons. But what happens when you run out of things to say about your neighbors? What happens when the sun goes down and the social grooming ends, but the brain is still humming with unused energy? This is where the boredom of the day transformed into the wonder of the night. When researchers studied the nighttime conversations of the Bushmen in Botswana, they found a startling shift. During the day, their talk was practical and social. But at night, 91% of the conversation turned to stories. They told myths, they told legends, and they talked about the supernatural. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a cognitive workout. A good story creates a shared mental world. It forces the listener to simulate scenarios they haven't experienced, which is the ultimate cure for an understimulated brain. The storyteller became the most valuable member of the tribe because they could transport everyone's mind out of the quiet cave and into a world of endless possibility. But if stories filled their minds, what did they do with their hands? Is it possible that the greatest masterpieces of human history were actually just the result of someone having nothing better to do? We often look at cave paintings and ancient carvings as sacred, ritualistic objects, but many archaeologists are beginning to see them as the world's oldest hobbies. Consider the zigzag shell found in Java. It is a freshwater mussel shell with a deliberate, geometric pattern scratched into it. It's not a tool. It's not a weapon. It's art. But here's the kicker. It wasn't made by a modern human. It was made by Homo erectus 500,000 years ago. Stephen Monroe, the researcher who first noticed the carvings, pointed out that the lines are incredibly precise, made with a shark's tooth. This wasn't a quick scribble. It was a slow, meditative act of creation. It was a person sitting by a river, 500,000 years ago, focused entirely on the feel of the tooth against the shell, simply because they wanted to see a pattern where there wasn't one before. But if they were carving shells for fun, what else were they making? Could the very foundations of our technology be rooted in a prehistoric attempt to stave off restlessness? In the Blombos Cave in South Africa, researcher Christopher Henshelwood discovered what he calls the world's first art studio. It dates back 75,000 years. He found kits for mixing ochre, a reddish pigment, stored in abalone shells. They weren't just painting walls, they were likely painting their bodies, their tools, and their clothes. They were experimenting with chemistry and color long before they had a reason to. When you look at a beautifully symmetrical Acheulean hand axe, you're looking at a tool that is far more perfect than it needs to be to cut meat. Some of these axes are so thin and delicate they would have broken the moment they hit a bone. This suggests that the people making them were over-engineering their tools, turning a chore into a craft. They were practicing what we now call flow state. The total immersion in a difficult task that makes time disappear. But what if the task wasn't physical at all? What if the most useless things they did were actually the sparks that lit the fire of modern science? Consider the Ishango bone, found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a baboon's leg bone with 3 columns of notches carved into it. For a long time, people thought it was just a tally stick for counting kills. But when you look closer, the notches are grouped in a way that suggests a mathematical understanding. One column contains prime numbers between 10 and 20. Another seems to track the phases of the moon. This wasn't a survival tool. You don't need prime numbers to catch a gazelle. This was the work of someone who was bored enough to look at the moon every night for months and wonder if there was a pattern. They were counting for the sake of counting. They were the first mathematicians, not because they needed to solve a problem, but because their brains were hungry for a structure to chew on. But did this drive for patterns always lead to something productive? Is it possible that our ancestors were just as prone to pointless, addictive distractions as we are today? While we don't have prehistoric apps, we do have evidence of the very first games. In the archaeological record, we find smooth, rounded stones and bone dice that predate written history. We find the game of Uar and Senet in ancient Egypt, but the impulses that created them go back much further. Anthropologists have observed that adult hunter-gatherers play constantly. They wrestle, they have breath-holding contests, and they throw rocks at targets. This is play in its purest form, the voluntary engagement in a difficult, unnecessary task. Evolutionary biologists argue that play is a way to practice for life, but for the person doing it, it's just a way to make the afternoon move faster. It's a way to generate a dopamine hit when the environment isn't providing one. But what happened when even play wasn't enough to fill the silence? Does the need for a new view explain why humans eventually covered every corner of the planet? There is a concept in behavioral ecology called optimal foraging theory, which suggests animals should move in the most efficient way possible to get food. But humans don't do that. We explore. We climb mountains just to see what's on the other side. We wander into deserts and across ice bridges where there is no guaranteed food. This restlessness is often driven by boredom. When the local valley becomes familiar and boring, the human brain starts to devalue it. The grass literally looks greener over the next hill because the brain rewards the discovery of new information with a burst of neurochemicals. This information-seeking behavior is what saved us. The bored teenager who wandered 5 miles further than anyone else was the one who found the new flint deposit or the hidden spring. Boredom was the engine of our migration. But what was the cost of all that wandering? If we were always moving and always seeking, did we ever find a way to just be still? There is one activity that ancient humans did that we have almost entirely lost: the art of doing absolutely nothing together. In many modern hunter-gatherer societies, there is a state of being that anthropologists call quiet presence. It's not meditation, and it's not sleep. It's just sitting. People will sit together for hours, barely speaking, watching the horizon or the fire. They aren't bored in the way we think of it, because they aren't fighting the silence. They have a higher tolerance for the nothingness of time. In our world, a 30-second elevator ride without a phone feels like a prison sentence. For them, a 4-hour afternoon sitting under a baobab tree was just They had an intimacy with time that we can't even imagine. They knew the exact way the light changed between 3 and 5 o'clock. They knew the specific sound of the wind before a storm. They were present in a way that our distracted brains find physically painful. But was this stillness a choice or a necessity? Could it be that our modern crisis of boredom is actually just our ancient brains reacting to a world that is too loud? We think of ourselves as being bored more often than our ancestors, but the truth is likely the opposite. We are overstimulated, which has raised our boredom threshold. We need more and more noise to feel a baseline level of engagement. Our ancestors, living in a low-stimulation environment, were sensitized to the smallest things. A single bird call or a strangely shaped leaf was enough to capture their attention for 20 minutes. Their boredom was a low-simmering fire that drove them to create, to talk, and to explore. Our boredom is a frantic, jagged thing that we try to drown out with infinite scrolls. We have the same brain, the same thirst for novelty, and the same 18 hours of affluent leisure time, but we've traded the bone flute for the algorithm. Is the feeling of boredom actually the most human thing about us? Think back to that man watching the beetle on the stone. He isn't wasting time. He is training his brain to observe, to focus, and to find meaning in the mundane. He is the one who will eventually notice the patterns in the stars, the one who will carve the first flute from a vulture's wing, and the one who will tell the stories that keep his tribe together. He is bored, and because he is bored, he is about to change the world. We are the descendants of the people who couldn't stand the silence, so they filled it with music. We are the children of the people who hated the empty walls, so they covered them with art. Boredom wasn't a bug in our evolution. It was the feature that forced us to build a civilization just to keep ourselves busy. But what happens when the civilization we built finally succeeds in eliminating every empty second? If we ever truly cure boredom with a perfect 24/7 stream of entertainment, do we lose the very thing that made us creative in the first place? If there is no silence, there can be no new songs. If there is no emptiness, there is no room for a new idea to take root. We are currently conducting a massive, species-wide experiment to see what happens when a creature evolved for quiet presence is plunged into a world of infinite distraction. We are running away from the beetle on the stone as fast as we can. But we might find that the beetle was the only thing keeping us sane. If you had to spend a full day in 50,000 BC, with no tools and no tasks, what is the first thing you would create to keep the silence at bay? Would you start scratching lines into the dirt, or would you find someone to tell your secrets to? We often think we're so different from those people sitting around the fire, but if you take away your phone for just 1 hour, you'll feel that same prehistoric itch. You'll feel the ghost of a man who lived 50 millennia ago, standing over your shoulder, waiting to see what you'll do with your time. He didn't have much, but he had a world that was wide and quiet and full of potential. He chose to fill it with us. The image of that single red ochre handprint on a cave wall in Spain or Indonesia is often cited as the first "I was here" in history. But maybe it was something simpler. Maybe it was just the result of a long, hot afternoon where there was nothing else to do. Maybe art, science, and religion were just the ways we distracted ourselves from the terrifying realization that we were alone in the dark. We have spent 50,000 years running away from the boredom of the cave, building taller and taller towers of noise to drown out the quiet. We've been so successful that we've forgotten why we started running in the first place. We think we've conquered the emptiness. We think we've finally filled the void. The ancient world was a place of staggering, heavy silence. A world where the only thing you could hear for days was your own breath and the wind in the grass. We call that leisure time now, but to a brain wired for connection and growth, that silence was a predator more dangerous than any saber-toothed cat. It was a vacuum that threatened to swallow the mind whole, forcing it to invent gods and math and music just to have something to hold on to. We are not the thinkers who survived. We are the disturbers of the peace. We are the restless animals who couldn't sit still in the garden, so we paved it over and built a theater. We have replaced the terrifying silence of the stars with the comforting hum of the machine, and we call it progress. But the silence hasn't actually gone anywhere, it's just waiting for the battery to die. In those few seconds between the screen turning off and the eyes adjusting to the dark, that ancient, itching heat in your chest comes back. It is the feeling of a brain that was designed to count the moon and carve the bone being forced to do nothing. It is the biological alarm bell that has been ringing since the first man watched a beetle on a rock, and it doesn't care about your entertainment. It only cares that you are still here, in the quiet, with nothing to do. And it is about to scream. When you look back at that handprint on the cave wall, you realize it isn't a greeting or a masterpiece. It is a desperate, lonely signal from a mind that was beginning to realize the true scale of the void. They weren't just painting, they were screaming into the silence so they wouldn't have to hear it. And the most terrifying part of human history is that the silence never answered back. We are still just children in the dark, telling stories to ourselves so we don't have to notice the quiet. What would you say if the silence finally spoke back? If you enjoy diving into the deep, strange history of our species and want to explore more of these forgotten corners of the human experience, consider joining us for the next journey. But for now, you should probably find something to do. The silence is getting louder. History is just a long, complicated way of avoiding the fact that we are sitting on a rock in the middle of nowhere.